It's my privilege to introduce to you Roberta Bobby Cordano. Bobby Cordano, JD, is the Director of Disability Services at the University of Minnesota, an office that is a recognized leader in promoting accessible teaching, learning, working, service, and social environments through the use of principles of universal design. Prior to her current position, Bobby was a prosecutor in the Minnesota Attorney General's office for 10 years. As an assistant attorney general, she also served as a member of the Minnesota Supreme Court Advisory Committee on Court Interpreters from 1994 through 2004, which worked to increase access to the courts for deaf, hard of hearing, and non-English speaking people. Bobby is one of the founding members of Metro Deaf School, a pre-K through 8 bilingual, bicultural charter school for deaf and hard of hearing children in St. Paul, Minnesota, which opened in 1993. She is also a founding board member of the Minnesota North Star Academy, a bilingual, bicultural charter high school which opened in the fall of 2004. Ms. Cordano grew up in a deaf family and is a native speaker of American Sign Language. She graduated with honors in sociology from Beloit College in 1986 and received her law degree from the University of Wisconsin Law School in 1990. And she is a member of the Minnesota Bar. Please extend a warm welcome to Bobby Cordano.
I just need to hook up. You know, we've entered into a new era when now speakers come up, they have to hook up, you know, it's technology. Hold on. Can you make sure that it gets over there? Oh. But why does it do that? Hold on. Yeah, there, that's better. Hey, well, good afternoon, I suppose. It still feels like morning. I got up quite early to come here, and it was a rather harried morning, I have to admit. I had a 7:10 flight, and I arrived at the gate at 7:05. So I'm very glad to be here. I just want to make a comment, too. I don't really know Omaha very well. I know that I lost one of my favorite students when I taught about 3 years ago. I taught a class about bridging the gap between deaf and hearing people through language and culture. And one of my students announced that she was transferring to Creighton University, and that was like one of the first times I heard of you, but I figured you must have been good because she came here. And so I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you for your very kind welcome. I've had a very nice morning here. I'm going to focus the keynote portion of this today on kind of thinking about a framework for achieving accessibility through the compliant component and then design. And I'm going to go through a couple things, and I'm trying to make the day here so that if you come to any one of the presentations after today, after this one, there won't be a lot of repetition. It's really designed to build on what I've done in this keynote, just for those of you who are here and wondering what's going to come up next. Let's just talk a little bit about what are some of the forces driving change. If you look now with regard to the student statistics, the percentage of college freshmen with a disability has more than tripled over the last 20 years. In 1978, there were 3%, and now, as of 1998, we're talking about nearly 9%. And I think some of the numbers I'm seeing people use is inching up toward 10 and 11%, depending on what institution that you're in. The number of high school graduates with disabilities matriculating in post-secondary education rose from 3% in 1978 to 19% in 1996. 1 in 11 first-time, full-time freshmen entering college in 1998 self-reported a disability, meaning they have hearing, speech, orthopedic, learning, health-related, or sight condition or other disability condition. More than 50% of students with disabilities enrolling in post-secondary education persist toward a degree or credential. And the number of students with Asperger's, how many people here know what Asperger's is? I'll give you a brief explanation. Asperger's, if you were to identify, most of you have heard of autism, I'm sure. If you take the spectrum of children with autism, Asperger's is on the very, some people might say the high end, high functioning end of autism, meaning that they have extremely high IQ, but what they don't have are typically are very short on social skills that we experience with autism. But so sometimes we say Asperger's is at high end. High sometimes is a judgmental word that I'm not quite sure what to do with, but I'll just use that phrase. But children with Asperger's, the number of children with Asperger's has grown by over 800% in this last decade. And what's very interesting is if you go to Silicon Valley, if you go to Rochester, Minnesota, where we have high-tech center, there are extremely high numbers of children with Asperger's because their parents probably had a fairly mild form of Asperger's, and they went into high-tech and infotechnology, information technology, research, high mathematics, physics, and so they then endeavored into these fields that are perfectly suitable for them. Then they marry each other. Then they have children who have even more severe Asperger's. And so that's one of the phenomena that we've seen around the country. Some of it is diagnosis, and some of it is we really don't understand what's causing Asperger's and autism. Is it environmental? Is it genetic? We don't know. But it is something important to know in terms of statistics and what the changing trends are and what we'll see in the future. Let's talk a little bit about workplace. We've got a lot of people here who work at Creighton University, so what do you look like? I can tell you a little bit about a national workforce. The median age is 40.5 in 2004. It's projected to be 41.4 in 2012. At the University of Minnesota, interestingly enough, the median age is 45. And I don't know here, I don't know, Bill, do you have any idea what the median age is of your workforce here? Yeah, 40, similar. So you're guessing. One of the things in higher education, because of tenure, I think we typically are seeing older workforces in higher education than we might see in the corporate sector. Stress is one of the fastest growing reasons for lost time. And when we say lost time, that's definitely kind of a term of art. And what that means is time away from work, absent from work. And stress is one of the leading causes for that. It's estimated that it's costing us $300 billion a year nationally. That's just due to stress. The growing number of people with disabilities in the workforce is also interesting. That number has increased to over 20 million workers in the United States, which constitutes 12.4% of the workforce. Now, I'm going to just give you a little side note. While that might look really good to you, what's very interesting is that workforce participation among people with disabilities is actually in some areas decreasing rather than increasing post-ADA. And we're not really sure what that's all about. And so I don't want you to walk away thinking, wow, people with disabilities are getting jobs. The reality is there's still a great deal of discrimination, and that number should be higher than what it is. And chronic illness, very interesting statistic. 1 in 3 people experience chronic illness in the United States. 1 in 3. So look around at your table. There are an average of 6 people at a table. 2 of you are likely to have a chronic illness. And if there aren't 2 of you at your table, there are probably 2 others at another table that will make up for the absence of those at your table. Oh, sorry. I want to talk a little bit about compliance, but before I go here, I'd like to get a sense of this audience. I don't really know how aware are you of the Americans with Disabilities Act? Do you feel, how many of you feel like you have a working knowledge of the Americans with Disabilities Act? How many of you feel like, gee, I have a working knowledge, but I'd like to know a little bit more? And how many of you know virtually nothing about the ADA? All right, not very many, but okay. I have a chart up here that, and let me back up 1 minute. I don't know if this handout of this presentation is made available to you. I think what you got today is is this one available to everybody? the keynote, or is it, I think the employment one is the one you have that I'll be talking about this afternoon. If you'd like a copy of this, we don't have a copy of that here. I can make that available to you electronically. We can probably put it on the ADA committee website. And if you'd like a hard copy, please contact Bill Hill, and they have copies of that in his office too. So it's available to you both ways. This chart, what's nice, the point of this chart really is to illustrate the difference between K-12 and post-secondary education and the workforce. That is, when under the IDEA, Individualized Disability Education Act, I think it is, IDEA, the school bears the responsibility for identifying a child with disability and then determining what accommodation will be provided to the student. Once the student leaves K-12, goes into post-secondary education and the workforce, the burden shifts. It's no longer the school or the public entity's responsibility to diagnose, figure out why this person isn't functioning the way that other people are. It becomes the individual's responsibility to disclose and to request accommodation. It's a critical difference that a lot of families and children do not understand when they make that transition from K-12 to post-secondary education. And those of you who are staff and or faculty, or and if you interact with students with disabilities in any way, sometimes the incoming freshmen and the parents are struggling a lot with, so now what are you going to do for me and how are you going to do all this stuff? And they expect more of the institution than what we are legally obligated to do. But that's a very critical difference to understand, is that the student must disclose. And I know at the University of Minnesota, we get a lot of freshmen that come to college and say, gee, my parents aren't here. They can't make me go to disability services. They can't make me ask for an accommodation. Gee, I'm going to try not doing anything at all because I don't want to have to deal with the embarrassment. I'm so sick and tired of having interpreters drag, and really it's usually not deaf kids. It would usually be students with learning disabilities that won't ask for extended time. Or they don't want to have to go and take a test in a separate testing center. And so they'll say, you know what, I'm just going to try to just do without it because I don't want my peers to know that I have LD, and let me just pass. And so what happens is they fail the midterm exam. They call mom and dad or their parents and say, I didn't do so well. Well, did you contact Disability Services like we talked about before you went? No. And then you can imagine the conversation after that. And the point being is that that student, the university has done nothing wrong. Whereas if we were a K-12 institution, we would have had an obligation to identify that student and to know that student was registered or had a disability before they came. So the burden of disclosure is on the student and or employee under these laws. I am actually going to skip over the ADA because I think the information that will be made available to you in the handout on this is also in the handout on employees. But I do want to talk a little bit about the definition of disability. A person with the disability has a disability if they have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity: walking, standing, seeing, speaking, hearing, breathing, taking care of oneself, or learning. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is only a list of examples. But what's really critical is that when we talk about disabilities, a lot of times we think about disabilities as those that are visible. And I want to just point out in this chart, you'll see that on the top we have systemic. Systemic is like MS. Someone who has MS has a systemic disability. If you go, for you it would be to the right, LD, ADHD, which stands for learning disabilities and attention deficit and hyperactive disorder. Psychiatric, acquired brain injury. Sensory, meaning deafness, sight. And mobility. These are some of the types of disabilities that you see. Now, you'll notice some of them are shaded, and what's the point of that? The ones that are shaded typically are the hidden disability. When I speak about this, I am fairly passionate about the fact that in 1990, when they passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, we had made some progress in achieving access for people with visible disability. Our society has gotten quite used to having interpreters. They've gotten quite used to the expectation that I might request an interpreter. We've gotten used to the expectation that there have to be ramps. We're used to the idea that we're going to have books in Braille. But our society is not used to the fact that we have more and more people who wear hearing aids that actually are having a harder and harder time communicating. They're not used to the fact that we have more and more people walking among us who have bipolar disorder, who have schizophrenia, who live with major depression. Our society is not used to the fact that there are chronic illnesses that are unpredictable in the effect that they have on the individual. And there is a great deal of bias today, and that is the work that many of us have to do in today's world around disability, is to focus on the hidden disability as much as we have focused on the people with visible disabilities and their need. The issues that we have with hidden disabilities is passing. I gave you the example of the student with LD who doesn't want to disclose because he doesn't want his classmates to know, faculty to know. But let's also talk, one of the things that in your workplaces, you probably have colleagues who have lost some hearing. They've started to wear hearing aids. You know they're probably missing something. They may not be getting everything, but nobody's talking about that. And they just pass because it's sure easier to pass than to say, can we just stop this meeting for a minute and have you repeat what you just said because I didn't understand that. That's not something hard-of-hearing people like to do very much. But let's talk about someone who has MS, might not disclose at all to their supervisor or peers for a very, very long time out of fear of stigma that, man, if I tell them now, what are they going to think of me? Are they going to think my productivity gone down? And if I'm sick tomorrow, they're going to think it's MS and actually I just had a cold. And, you know, people jump to conclusion. Another thing that's very difficult is that when people start to experience chronic illnesses, in particular, suddenly their identity starts to shift, and they no longer quite are sure what world they belong in. If you can imagine a world with people with disabilities, or there's this middle world of people who are in transition between being disabled and not, if you will, there is a continuum, and they're shifting in a very different direction. It's very difficult to deal with. A lot of hidden disabilities are also involve erratic symptoms, if you will. They're not always predictable in how they manifest themselves. Even me, who I consider myself deaf, but I am functionally probably more hard of hearing. With one person, I will do fabulously well. And in fact, I can have a meeting with 3 people that I know very well and whose voices I can understand. And you put me in a room with another, same number of people, and I can barely function. And there are so many different factors. It could be the room, it could be the accent, it could be a number of different things. But it's very unpredictable in terms of how I will be able to function from one situation to another. The other thing is very challenging, and the ADA doesn't help any of us with this, is that the ADA there is a burden of proof to have to prove you have a disability. That's a very awkward and difficult process for a lot of people, and it's one that they sometimes don't even want to have to bother with, so they would rather not have to do that. And the biggest thing to keep in mind is that one of the fastest growing groups of people with disabilities is people with psychiatric disabilities. At the University of Minnesota, it is now the largest group of students and employees that we serve. But, you know, it's interesting. Up until 2 years ago, LD was the largest group of students that we serve. And you know what's interesting? I don't think we have more than 2 people among the, we have 55,000 students at the university and probably about, I think, over 20,000 employees, something like that. And we only have 2 employees, I think, in our office that are registered to have learning disability. So where are these people with learning disability going? Are they not disclosing when they come to the University of Minnesota and work for us? Do they not come to work for us? I mean, I don't know what's happening. But it's astonishing when you see the numbers of employees registered. They don't reflect the numbers of students that are registered. I'm going to skip through because I'm aware of what I want to talk about today is to focus a little bit more on a paradigm shift. You guys all know what the law says. You know what we're obligated to do. That's fine. But let's talk a little bit about a paradigm shift that I want to challenge you all to take your thinking and kind of turn it around on its head, if you will. First of all, are many of you familiar with the social model? Good. Great audience for this. Okay. The ADA is based on, essentially, on the medical model. The disability is basically a deficiency or an abnormality, okay? It says, you prove to me that you have a disability, so you have to come into an office and say, here's my documentation. And you look at my audiogram and it'll tell you how deaf I am, if you will. But on that paper, that audiogram shows you how deaf I am relative to what? To a hearing person who has so-called normal hearing. So what we're measuring is the depth or breadth of my deficit, okay? The disability resides in the individual, right? I come in and I'm the one who has the disability. I wear the hearing aid. I'm the one who needs to use a sign language interpreter. It resides in me as the individual. The remedy is the cure or normalization of the individual. Now, one of the things that's very interesting is that I have deaf parents. I spoke ASL since birth, but what's very interesting is the important emphasis on speaking, on learning how to behave like a hearing person, adhering to the hearing norms of the world. That's all about fixing me so that I can get along with all of you. Interesting. That's what much of my life has been outside of my family. In the deaf community, they see nothing wrong with me. They look at me and say, that's Bobby. My hearing, there is no deficit. In fact, it's a positive thing that I'm deaf. That I sign is a positive thing. In fact, there are a lot of, you may have read articles about deaf people wanting to have deaf children, in part because that's normal in that culture. And I wanted to say, when I said, to get along with all of you, there is no judgment placed in that, except it is what our society does expect of people with disabilities, is that we have to learn to function in the world. The world doesn't change itself for us. And the agent of the remedy, the person who cures or fixes me, is usually a professional, is someone who fixes my hearing aid, it fits me with the hearing aid, recommends a cochlear implant, likewise. And I'm using my example to keep it somewhat personal. But I want, when I talk about my deafness, what I'd like for you to do is to make it whatever is real for you. If it's someone you know who's in a wheelchair, just change the disability, but it's very much the same in terms of the example. The social model was developed by Carol Gill, and this is the paradigm shift. Instead of disability being a deficiency or an abnormality, it's the different. It's being disabled itself is neutral. So it's not necessarily compared to a normal condition. We just recognize it as a different. I am unable to hear, you can hear, but that is noted as a different. And disability derives not from the medical condition, but from the interaction between the individual and society. Now, how many of you in this room know a little bit of sign language? We've got a couple, right? Good. I mean, more and more of our children are learning, right? And what's interesting is that if you can sign a little bit, suddenly that barrier in the world, for me, is diminished, right? Our world get closer and closer together. And when we provide wheelchair access, and sorry to use you as an example, Mark, but if I may, if this campus is completely accessible, the fact that Mark wheels around in a wheelchair is completely irrelevant, isn't it? It only becomes relevant when a power door doesn't open, perhaps. When I think I saw in that video, the guy had to go and actually click some button, that Mark would not be able to reach to open the door. That's when the disability becomes real and material. It's the environment that is disabling, in other words. It's not the condition that the individual holds. And then the remedy is the change in the interaction between the individual and society. Now, that interaction can happen in a number of different ways. It can be a physical change in the environment. It can be an attitudinal change. It can be a programmatic change or a policy change. The key thing is if we have the right approach between two individuals and recognizing that this is a person and I'm a person and we just have two differences in how we work in the world, and we're going to work to navigate that, suddenly the way we change that interaction to achieve the goal of whatever we're trying to do is what material. So, for example, providing a sign language interpreter is a change in the interaction. It provides me communicative access to this environment. But so does it also provide you with communicative access, because at some point, I don't have them speaking for me, but at some point we'll have some dialogue. I'll be asking some questions, and I'll give you a scenario later in the afternoon. And when you speak back to me, I will have an interpreter behind you signing back to me. Well, that interpreter is working for you, not just for me, right? Because that way I can make sure I understand you. So the interpreter is interpreting you to me, but working for you in that instant. So that's a change in the interaction. And the agent of the remedy can be the individual, it can be an advocate, it can be a professional, it can be anybody. There isn't any one expert that has to solve this problem. So what that does is, when you think about your student empowerment network, I mean, it's the idea of empowering all of us in this room to be the one to change the nature of the interaction between all the individuals on this campus. This brings us to universal design. Universal design is the design of products and environment to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. It's not just one size fits all. The primary goal of universal design is to create flexible, customizable product, courses, programs, activities, and environment. And I've already kind of led you up to this, but there are 4 environments that have to be examined to create meaningful access. So before we get to universal design and some of the actual to-do, the one thing that I'd like to do is to set this up for all of you. And so if you can think in these terms of these 4 environments and everything that you do and that you touch, you will materially change the interaction between you and the people in your community. So the 4 environments are physical, programmatic, policy, informational, and attitudinal. So what does that mean? So let's examine your world for a minute. Physical environments. We got a little tour on the video a moment ago. That includes doors, entryways. You have that's actually a student union on a campus. So you can see that it's kind of hard to see, but there's a power door, and the doors open up, and you can see there's a kind of a flat sidewalk. That building is ideally accessible for just about anyone walking in. If you've got MS, you don't have to traverse up some stairs to get into these doors. If you have your hand full of books and you need to get through these doors, what do? Bend down and bump the power door opener. So really what that is, universally designed, it's intended to provide meaningful access to that physical environment. And then the right-hand corner is an example of a drop-off. And you can see there that there's a drop-off there. There's also a curb cut. But there's plenty of room in this area for a van to pull up, the doors are open for people to come. And that's just an example of a design of an exterior sidewalk. That's actually outside of a voting booth, I think. Then, let's see, it would be your left-hand corner. It's an example of a device that actually helps navigate. It's a little ramp that goes over small bumps that are just like 1 inch tall. And it can be something that people might easily trip over or not be able to navigate well, and it's something that can be hard for even a chair to wheel over. And this is just an example of an adaptation that can be put into an existing area that's problematic. And then the last picture is actually of a dorm room. And I have to admit, I've looked at this, and I actually think the picture of the dorm room you have on your website is a little bit better. Because this one still looks a little narrow to me. And that door on the right and the far back, I don't know what that leads to. But I don't know exactly how easy it would be to wheel around that room. But anyway, but this is theoretically an accessible room, and you can see in the bathroom they've got some rods there that make it easy to stand up and sit down if you're going to the bathroom. Programmatic and policy environments. What does that mean? This is probably the one that most people have the greatest difficulty with. What this means is we set up policies and programs every single day. You write syllabi, and you put in your syllabi requirement that students have to adhere with that may have some artificial requirement that create barriers for students unintentionally. And so the question you have to ask yourself is this requirement necessary? For example, one of the issues that comes up the most is time test. How many of you feel that, well, I shouldn't ask, I'm not going to, we've had this discussion about whether time tests are essential to demonstrate learning. And there has been a study that I've seen where it showed that when they gave unlimited time to students on a test, the student performed no differently when they had unlimited time compared to when they had, an hour, for example. And so one of the questions that we often raise is, what is it that we're measuring when we give time tests? Because one of the effects of having time tests is that if you have a test that goes for an hour and a student has LD and they get time and a half, the result usually is that we have to take that student, remove them from that learning environment and their peers, and they go somewhere else to take the test so they can have an hour and a half. Now, what's very interesting is, so if this test was designed for an hour, why don't they just schedule the testing room for an hour and a half so that nobody has to leave the room? Or for 2 hours so nobody has to leave the room. That's one option. Or the other option is just ask yourself, why am I timing this? Sometimes I think, the thing that I'm challenged by is that I think that fluency, sometimes people believe the speed with which you think is a measure of your knowledge or fluency of knowledge. And so what's interesting is that true? That, are you somehow smarter, better because you can do the test in 2 minutes as opposed to 4 minutes? What are we really proving? And that's an example of a programmatic barrier that could be placed. And I have to tell you, this topic is a very controversial one in mathematics, for example, and I don't think we're working on this issue with our Department of Mathematics at the University of Minnesota, so I expect someone to pull me up afterwards and say, you know what, I have a bone to pick with you, Cordano. It's not an easy one. But there's also the policy and programmatic things that we put in our workplaces that create barriers. There are sometimes expectations that you have to come to work by 8 o'clock, and you have to leave at a certain time of day, when there's nothing essential about being at your desk at 8 o'clock. Nobody comes in to see you at 8 o'clock. And whether you come in at 8 o'clock or 8:30, actually there may not be material. But I know that there are workplaces, and we talked the other day about this in one of our committees, that the whole culture that we have early morning this meeting at 7:30. And if you can't do that, then it's not a place where you're going to succeed. But that's an example of a programmatic barrier that's in a workplace that might actually create problem for an individual who is on medication that has a harder time in the morning, that they have to allow their medication to adjust. And so they actually become more functional, not at, they'll be functional at 8:30 as opposed to 8 o'clock. And so those are things that we've set up in our society as a result of sometimes it's just habit. Okay. Informational environments are the internet, signage. It even includes pagers, sidekicks type devices, or telephone. There are different means by which we receive information. We put in sign language interpreters in the category of informational environment because as a person who is deaf, I need to receive information and through a communication mean, and I do that through an interpreter. Likewise, blind people, they can't necessarily just open a book. They will either get it in Braille or they'll have it through a screen reader. But what's interesting about informational is that I have a great example from the University of Minnesota. We had a president prior to this one, Udolph, who was brand new to our campus. He came up from Texas. And what was most fascinating was he kept getting lost. And he kept calling and saying, where am I? And finally, he was the one who said, we got to get some signs up. And that was the start of the Gopher Way. So now we have signs all over campus that are called the Gopher Way. And all they do is tell you, if you want to get to William from here, and there's a tunnel system. I mean, that's the big thing. He kept getting lost in our tunnel system. And you can now know Williams is that way, Northrop is that way. And so these signs tell you where you are. But what's interesting, this was the president of the university we were putting up signs for. It wasn't, people with disabilities. But what's interesting is that he needed something that people with disabilities need too, and that's informational access. And so it's an example yet of how what's good for people with disabilities is often good for everybody else. And we often talk about signage, but it was something we all learned, and it actually was to the benefit of everybody on our campus. It was great. And then the last environment is attitudinal. attitudinal access is probably about 80% of the problem in terms of problem and solution, if you will. What this means is that it is how people view and treat one another, how we interact with one another, and it involves the stereotypes that we carry around with each other about other people and the differences that they may have. We have a great quote from a student who said, you know, it feels like people are saying, we let you in, why do you need anything more? And that quote really exemplifies for me kind of that feeling. They walk around and that's an attitudinal barrier. They just feel that why should we do anything more? It's that sense of not being an unwelcome environment. When we talk about universal design, it's intended to create an inclusive environment. One of the challenges that we've had at University of Minnesota, and I was looking here, and I don't believe that your multicultural affairs include disability. I think that you separate out your multicultural affairs. That doesn't include disability. Am I correct? At the University of Minnesota, we actually have had disability services, GLBT, Office of University Women, African American. Now it's actually Multicultural Center for Academic Excellence under one umbrella. And what I'm going to show you, talk about now, is actually some material that I've developed over the last 2 months in response to this collaboration and our thinking about universal design, because we're going through some changes at the U. And one of the things that's been most interesting about this collaboration is that I know that people typically carry more than one identity. You can be an Asian American woman and also be a lesbian and have a disability. And what will happen is that if you ask that person, so what emerges for you first when you walk into the room, they'll say, oh, it's the fact that I'm Asian. The first reaction people have to me is that of being an Asian. And then it's that of being a woman. So I have to deal with those two things first. They may never know that I'm a lesbian, so that doesn't come up until later, until they ask me about, you know, my kids and my husband and stuff. And then suddenly that becomes a reality. But it may never surface in terms of their sexual orientation. Might never emerge as an issue, but their race and their gender may make a difference. And then the disability, you know, may or may not, if there is a disability, again, if it's a chronic illness, you may never know. Or you may know. After you meet me, when you first meet me, you might say, funny voice. And it might take you a few minutes to figure out that I'm hard of hearing and that I identify as being deaf. But that might, you'll really be looking at me as a woman first, and then I'm short, right? So there's another one. But the idea being that, you know, our identities interact with the environment in very different ways. I mean, I can even point out, think about other things. There are people who have been raised in alcoholic families. And what's interesting is they'll walk into an environment and suddenly they'll see something and they will react to that. And it will be based on their experience and having grown up in a family that was alcoholic. And they had that identity of having grown up in that environment, and that brings out a reaction. It's no different than some of these other kind of identities. Is that, but that's what will surface for you if you walk into a bar, for example, and you see some drunk people and their reaction. You may have, that's what becomes emergent for you. We all have those kind of emotional and physical reactions to our environment. And so part of the work that I've tried to do here, and I want to introduce and try out with all of you, if you will, is looking at universal design for diversity. And what does it mean to create universally designed environments that are intended to be welcoming for all people, particularly people who are historically underrepresented or marginalized. And before I go further with this, I want to point out to you is that I had a handout that I thought we might be able to hand out, and it not here. And it is something that you may want to start with, and we will make it available through the website. And it's on the 7 principles of universal design that came out of North Carolina, and they're basically those principles were written to deal with products, environment, and communication. And what I've done is taken those 7 principles and said, okay, how would we do this in thinking about our environment that we work, play, teach, learn, and socialize in? What would it look like if we created an environment that were really universally designed for every person in that room? And so and this is intended to be broad enough to capture the umbrella of all the groups under our multicultural affairs umbrella at the U of M, and I'm bringing it here to see if there's any value to you. One is build barrier-free, welcoming environment with attention paid to attributes that include usability, diverse content, access to artwork and graphic design, and geographic location relative to function. And what this means is, do you walk into all the rooms in the admin building and see pictures of white male presidents? Is that very welcoming to everybody who might be in that room, to always be seeing artwork of, white male president? We have a couple of rooms like that in our administration building. It's fine to have a couple rooms like that, but if every room on your campus has images of only white male, that's not, in terms of access to artwork, it doesn't speak to the broad range of people in your community. Think about geographic location relative to function. What's interesting is, I love this, we've talked about building neighborhoods, and what's very interesting is that when you think about what we do, are the things that you do, is where you place your places relevant to the function? Are they located in close proximity to one another? Do your physical spaces make sense so that it's easy to traverse from one place to the other? So when you think about designing a building and designing a space, where is your copy center? Where is your printer in your office? Is the printer isolated way in another corner? Or is the printer, do you have them in several locations so that everybody can just get up from their office and walk out no more than 10 paces and get a copy from a printer? And what's interesting about that is, if we talk about chronic illnesses, think about how awkward it would be for them to have to go and act, to have a printer placed in a special place for them. We want to avoid having to do those kinds of things. So really thinking about function, and then where these things are placed relative to function. And when we talk about usability can range from having door handles that are, like the ones over here, they're long, and you just press it, and it opens. But usability also includes furniture in your offices. I understand you have like an ergonomics office here, that people have chairs that work well for them. Every individual is different. I'm 5'1.5", I have to give you the little half-inch. But, we have people in here who are 6 feet tall, and, we all, different waists and sizes. I tell you, the chair I like is not going to be the same chair that some of the other people in this room like, too. So, usability and thinking about how we design our spaces to be adaptable and flexible and easy to use for the widest range of people. Second principle, create spaces and programs that foster a sense of community for all students. And in here, I just realized this, and I should have employees and staff. Sorry about that. Particularly people from underrepresented communities. What this means is that there is, what's interesting is we had this conversation the other day. Imagine if you are a white person, and we had this long discussion the other day, white people tend to, I think, identify as white when there are other groups that we'll talk to them about in relative, they're African American, not necessarily black, but we don't talk to us about ourselves as being European American, and it's very interesting that, what do we call ourselves? But what this relates to is the idea that most of the time, those of us who are white, and I speak for myself included, is we walk into environments and we will see more people like us. And we feel comfortable because we see more people like us. But when you have someone who comes in who is African American, Hispanic, Chicano, Latino, they come in, they'll hear perhaps a different accent. What they hear are a different norm of behavior and expectation. I mean, take someone who's Hispanic walking into a room, and they are what I call code switching, and in order to adapt to that environment. And so what happens is that people need to find pockets and places where they feel comfortable. It can be in one setting. You can design it to be multicultural and everybody feels comfortable. And you can design places where, black people can gather and have lunch together. We notice that if you look at the cafeteria in a school, children will gather oftentimes by their race, or if they have a group of students who are deaf, they'll gather over here. And as much as we want them to always be interacting with one another all the time, that may not happen. And the reason for that is what I will explain to you is what I call going home. I talk about with the deaf community about needing to go home, and I get replenished when I'm among deaf people, and I'm signing, and I'm not having to worry about talking, I'm not using English, and my manners and my mannerism change drastically from how I'm behaving with you, for example. Drastically meaning there's a shift for me, and you will notice if you just watch me in that setting, I'm different than how I am standing before you right now. And to me, there's a sense of comfort that comes from being in that space. And I need that space. Now, do I need it in the workplace? Maybe not. If I'm a student living at the University of Minnesota or living here at Creighton University, might I need that? Maybe. I'm not home anymore. And so I'm going to be looking for that home, that place where I get replenished. And so that's what this is. For all of you, it could be different things. It might be joining an outdoor club. That is a home. That's a sense of community. Let me just double check. Okay. Principle 3, design accessible and appropriate physical environment that provide ease of use for people who use different modes of interacting and communicating and allow for confidential use based on the services, programs, or benefits being delivered. This is a lot about physical access. I don't have to repeat that. An appropriate physical environment really talks about confidentiality. There are some things when we talk about healthcare issues that we might have, financial matters that we might have, our sexual identity, our sexual orientation. There are a lot of things about which we might want to have privacy and confidentiality. And so we need to make sure we're designing environments that when those topics we know they will come up, there is appropriate confidentiality and privacy afforded to all the individuals present. That's very important in designing our spaces. Principle 4, ensure that non-electronic information environments are accessible and appropriate so that information is delivered in format understandable by and easily usable by diverse users without requiring unnecessary steps or hoops to jump through for completion. What this means is when a blind person brings up the website for the ADA committee, that person isn't going to have to call Mark and say, you know what, it doesn't work with my screen reader. I don't know what the images are here because you haven't put the alt tag behind the picture to tell me what's there. That's just jumping through a hoop to have access to that. I'm sorry, this is non-electronic information. So this is a book, for example. Books, if we can have books made available electronically as well as in print, then that's accessible to people who are blind. Likewise, having the availability of interpreters, captioning is another example of having non-electronic information accessible. And another thing that's interesting is that when we show videos, an example of jumping through hoops is having to get an interpreter to interpret a video. That's just, if it were captioned in the first place, we wouldn't have, that hoop. Principle 5, design and maintain internet and other electronic environments to ensure accessibility and appropriate confidentiality or privacy. The example I gave about the website. But what's interesting is that there's a lot of information on the internet that is private and sensitive, and are we making sure that that information is being kept appropriately under wraps where it is not for public consumption? Principle 6, create inclusive and respectful policies and programs that from the beginning take into consideration the diverse student and employee population at the university and provide natural and cognitive support to ensure full utilization of programs by students and employees. Imagine, we talk about natural supports a lot, and what that means is sitting down if you're serving a student and saying, what have we just talked about? What will you do next? And have the student identify that for us. But if we think about how we serve our students, how we work with our employees from the very get-go, that will make a big difference in terms of the accessibility and the welcomeness of these programs. And lastly, hire and develop personnel who understand, respect, and value the university's diverse community of students and employees. I can't say enough about it's not only just looking at making sure that we hire people who are diverse into our workplaces, but it's also training the people who are already there and making sure that we're all aware of the thing that we can do to improve the environment for everyone. And that really, and given that we are human enterprises, our university, we are more about people than we are about things. And so what we often forget to talk about when we design our environment is we forget to talk about the human capital. And we really need to start thinking about the investments in our human capital and what will we do and what will you do to invest in your human capital to make sure that they are creating environments that are welcoming for everyone. And if we talk about compliance versus design, under the ADA, we remove barriers to reasonable accommodation. If you look at universal design, we remove barriers for the widest use of participants or users through design. And what that means is that if you design your environment correctly, the need to provide reasonable accommodation is diminished. Will you get rid of the need to provide specific individualized accommodation? Probably not. We'll probably always, for some length of time, need to have sign language interpreters. That gap is pretty large. It would be hard to navigate that completely. But boy, there's a lot of other things that we can do that would eliminate the need for reasonable accommodation. So the idea is to diminish this need for these individualized accommodations through creating accessible environment. Secondly, under the ADA, with the exception of some construction guidelines, it is largely implemented on a case-by-case basis. And one of the things that is Director of Disability Services at the University of Minnesota, one of the things we're starting to talk about is there's got to be a better way. It is too expensive to have to deal with every situation on a case-by-case basis. Let's change our environment and remove those barriers. And then what happens is that those situations that have risen into become a crisis, we really eliminate a lot of the situation that we've experienced over the last 5 years just through changing our environment. And it is that effect. The more you design your environment to be accessible in our university design, the need for individualized attention to situations becomes diminished. There is a direct correlation. Okay, curb cuts. How many of you like curb cuts? How many of you notice when there isn't one there? How many of you kind of get mad? That's interesting because in 1973, everybody was mad that we had to put curb cuts in. I mean, if you go and look at the newspapers across the country, there were editorials. Why are we doing these curb cuts? This is costing us money. This is just for who? We don't know who these people are that are going to use these curb cuts. And now it's flipped. 30 years later, those of us who are walking and not using wheelchairs and wheeling around are saying, where's that curb cut? I'm pulling the wagon with my boys. There's no curb cut. I'm kind of mad. It's inconvenient. Now I've got to lift up the wagon with, 40 pounds of weight in that. Very interesting change, but that's universal design. That is the first and best example of universal design I think we have in the United States that was implemented from coast to coast. And so we talk about curb cuts that go back to the environment. There are physical and design curb cuts. And when I have talked with architects and I've asked them, say, okay, so what is the curb cut in the area of architectural design in the future? You tell me. Every one of you in this room has an opportunity to figure out when we talk about physical and design curb cuts in your offices, your classroom, and whatever spaces you may work in. Look around and think about what are the curb cuts that you could make that everybody would like and benefit from. What would that look like? Electronic curb cuts. Are there ways that we can communicate, work together, play together, work together through electronic means that are efficient, useful, helpful, appropriately confidential? One of the biggest breakthroughs for deaf people in the workplace, for example, email wasn't invented for deaf people, was it? But boy, has it become one of the greatest equalizers for us or what? It's been marvelous, but what's interesting? It's suddenly equalized. Used to be that hearing people pick up the phone and call one another, and there'd be a deaf person in the workplace, and they wouldn't be part of those conversations happening, right? And everybody gets in the habit of picking that phone call. Now what's interesting, how many of you, it's more of a habit to get to the keyboard to do an email than to pick up the phone? We're changing, isn't it? And so now it's not so inconvenient to talk to that deaf colleague of yours because suddenly we're all pretty comfortable with the email. But that's an example of an equalizer that nobody intended that to happen that way. But it is amazing how, there's some technology that have been developed for people with disabilities. The pager, how many of you have pagers in this room? It's actually a small number. I'm surprised. If you go to, we have, in Minnesota, at least in the Twin Cities, I don't know, a lot of us seem to have more of them. BlackBerry? We have a BlackBerry user in this room? One, two BlackBerry, three. Oh, wow, you guys are kind of shy. Don't be so shy. I understand that, like the device to carry around. I had it for a little while, but it didn't work so well for me. But, we laugh about how, it's about being accessible, but it's also an example of it can be a curb cut for being able to reach people, to communicate with them, and to achieve the goal that you may have in your interaction. Academic curb cut. If later on I will talk a little bit about universal instructional design. There is a whole movement. If you're not aware of it, you may want to pass along with your colleagues. By the way, can I ask, how many are service providers in this room? How many of you are faculty? And then staff? I don't know if I should just staff. You might not. Okay, all right. What's interesting when we talk about academic curb cut is, we talk about syllabi, and there are things that you can do and words and language that you can use in your syllabus. There is also expectations of students that you can craft in a certain way that are really fit with the principles of universal instructional design. At the University of Minnesota, we've done a lot of work around this area too. And so that's what I mean by this, and I will talk a little bit about that later today. Workplace curb cut, we've been talking a little bit about that. And social curb cuts. What are things that you can do in your social interaction that will create more welcoming and engaging environments for all the members of your community? Future trends in higher education, and I'll kind of wrap up here. The responsibility for designing, creating accessible environments will be shared throughout the institution. And increasingly so, because I can say from an administrative standpoint, we've been watching our accommodation budget grow and grow and grow and grow. Our accommodation budget at the University of Minnesota, just to give you an idea, is about $1.8 million right now. And what I've managed to do is to slow down some of the growth of that, in part by looking at changing some of our environment. And if we can change the way professors teach, change the way classes are designed, change the way some services are delivered, change accessibility to information technology, we can reduce some of the individualized cost of accommodation. And thereby we focus less on case-by-case accommodation than more on system change. The other benefit of system change is if you change your system, people no longer have to feel conflicted about disclosing. The person who has MS is still going to be able to keep on working, and if he or she wants to tell someone that they've got MS, they can do that. If they don't want to have to tell someone they've got MS, they may not have to, because the workplace has been designed in such a way that they can ask for what they need without having to disclose. That's the ideal. We need to continue to explore new applications of technology to remove barriers or improve access, and develop sustainable strategies that will benefit the widest range of people in the institution community. And really, it's about thinking of design as opposed to compliance. If you stay with compliance, it's only going to get you so far, and in the long run, it will cost you more money. If you start moving from the goals of compliance, which is to change our environment, ultimately, what you'll find yourself doing is saving money in the long run and having a more engaged, welcoming, and dynamic community. Thank you very, very much.